Good morning, everybody, and thank you for coming along to this lecture. My name's Louise Butler. I'm the Senior Policy Advisor for the Social Workers Registration Board of South Australia. Welcome to the lecture, National Registration, A Way Forward. We're so pleased that so many people are interested in hearing about the journey that we have been on and the things that we've learned along the way. I'd like to introduce Professor Sarah Wendt. She's the Director of the Social Workers Registration Board of South Australia, and she's going to be talking today about our learnings and reflections over the last 2 years and all of the work that we have done in that time, that we as a team of senior academics, senior social workers, public servants and lawyers have done to get to where we are today. I want to just remind people that we will be taking questions, or let people know that we will be taking questions at the end. We'll look through and answer as many questions as we are able to in the time. If we're not able to get to your questions by the end of our time, we will provide an answer in writing. We will also be putting documents into the chat as Sarah mentions those, because there's a great deal of information we want to share. We can't speak about it all, but we want to provide that detail. So those documents will be uploaded into the chat as Sarah mentions them, and they will also be available on our website afterwards. Just a quick reminder also that we have a inbox, and people ask us questions or ask for information all the time, and we get back to people as soon as we're able to. Sometimes it's a day, sometimes it may take a week, depending on what we're doing, but we do make a commitment to get back to all questions as soon as possible. I'll come back at the end and look at the questions for Sarah. And in the meantime, let's hear from Sarah. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Louise. It's important, though, before I begin, that representing the Social Workers Registration Board, that we all acknowledge that the land we work on is the traditional lands of Aboriginal peoples here in South Australia, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. We also want to acknowledge and respect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the First Nations peoples of this country, and recognise them as the traditional owners and occupants of Australian land and waters. Particularly for social work, it is important that we acknowledge the violence of the colonial past and social work's part in this history, and the impacts that colonisation continues to have on First Nations people. But equally, it's important that we also acknowledge the strong and the enduring connection to land and culture for First Nations people. Also, before I jump into this presentation, it's important for me to acknowledge that I'm surrounded by people that continue to support the work of the Social Workers Registration Board, and I particularly want to thank Louise Butler, Ali Elder, Dia Shalukta, Olivia Parkinson, Kate Seymour and Chris Reynolds, and also the support of the board and the recent inaugural Aboriginal Committee. So, the purpose of today. I thought that it was a wonderful time to come together for the purpose of this lecture to provide an opportunity to come together as interested people to talk about national registration. In addition, it is to share with you the progress in South Australia and in actual fact, the actual valuable lessons that we're learning along the way. And these lessons are particularly important to note for national registration. I also want to say it's a privilege to work with state government in establishing a registration framework, and I've learned a great deal about what's required for registration and the importance of listening to many diverse key stakeholders and understanding their concerns, their hopes, and actually their realities. So I talk about the possibility of national registration with excitement and actually embrace this moment where social work is looking at itself, asking questions about our purpose and our place in the social, human and health services. I made an argument a couple of weeks ago in my lecture called Why Registration Matters, and Olivia will pop this in the chat for you. That is, it is the social work profession, it's us that need to come together to understand and build a registration framework that embraces everything we want social work to be. Social work is unique in its identity because it's grounded in social justice, relational practice, and the socio-political advocacy of naming and responding to inequalities in our society. It is this that needs celebrating and to be distinct. But also, as social work in Australia, we do need to own our history in colonisation and think seriously about what decolonisation truly means in a regulatory environment. And so conversations about national registration need to be inclusive of our social justice agenda and bring many diverse experiences and knowledge with us. My position description as Director for the Social Workers Registration Board also asks me to support advocacy across jurisdictions for a national social worker registration scheme. And I take this seriously. This is why the Social Workers Registration Board has also considered conduct and competency to build consistency and focus that's actually required for regulation. And Olivia will put this conversation I had a couple of weeks ago in the chat for you to also access. I invite you to listen to this lecture on conduct and competency and listen to why they are essential pillars in any regulatory framework as they talk to what we expect a social worker to know and to be, and therefore what they require in terms of education standards. So this talk today, this conversation, is also another expression of representing the Social Workers Registration Board in my role as Director to support advocacy for national registration and inviting collaborative conversations with you, my colleagues, as we think about the possibility for national registration and reflect on learnings together so that we might be able to move forward with some level of consistency and as a collective. This is my hope. So before we can talk about national registration and moving forward together, it is important to recognise history and the current state of knowledge that we find ourselves in here in Australia. Efforts to achieve national registration of social workers in Australia have been underway for several decades, and I want to thank the AASW for their advocacy and their efforts to keep registration on the government agendas. So since the 1980s, there has been advocacy for registration, and over time, we have seen many different views about the need for registration and/or which regulatory model might suit us. In addition, we've watched the histories and options of other professions unfold to national registration, like teachers over time, or more recently, the paramedics, which we can actually learn from. What one can perhaps conclude is that obtaining registration, and in particular national registration, can seem like a complex maze to work through. It is not necessarily a linear, simple process. But having said that, we have actually made progress, and I want to acknowledge the most recent forms of progress. Firstly, we've seen the review of the NRAS and APRA between 2023 and 2025. More recently, in the last couple of years, we have also seen the establishment of the Social Workers Registration Act 2021 in South Australia. It is important to acknowledge both these recent milestones as they provide us with insights into the possibilities of national registration of social work. So let's talk about the National Registration and Accreditation Scheme first, the NRAS. So the NRAS captures health and allied health professions. So your doctors, your nurses, OTs, psychology, Chinese medicine, paramedics, and so on. For those who don't know, NRAS was established by the Australian state and territory governments in about 2010 to create a single national system for regulating health practitioners. So the scheme is governed by the Health Practitioners Regulation National Law, the national law as we say, and it's enacted by each jurisdiction and it's supported by the Australian Health Practitioners Regulation Agency, AHPRA. So when you hear NRAS or social work and AHPRA, this is what we're talking about. In AHPRA, each profession is represented by a national board, and the national boards are merit-based and selected by the health ministers. So there has been much advocacy over decades to include social work under this scheme, positioning social work as an allied health profession. But this has not been successful, and we have actually seen this play out again recently. So between 2023, the independent review of the NRAS was called, and Sue Dawson was the independent reviewer. So you may have heard terms like the Dawson Review or the Complexity Review. So this is what we are talking about, the independent review of the NRAS, which began in 2023. This review was asked to identify unproductive and unnecessary complexity in the NRAS and recommend changes to improve regulatory outcomes, enhance public safety, and support the health workforce. Sue Dawson identified key areas of complexity within the scheme, and she made 26 specific recommendations. Her report was released in September 2025. You can read about this review in the Transforming Health Professions Regulation in Australia final report, and Olivia will pop this in the chat for you so you can quickly access it. In the 96-page report, social work is only mentioned twice. Firstly, in the context of advocacy from the AASW, when speaking to the question of whether the scope of the national scheme ought to be expanded to explicitly enable inclusion of any professions that work in the broader social care sector, as well as partially in health settings, for example, social work. But in the report, the following is stated. Firstly, where services cross a range of portfolios, the need for registration standards regarding services other than health should be considered. It also states health ministers may not be the most appropriate body to approve registration standards. Another form of regulation other than health professional regulation under the NRAS may be more appropriate. And finally, expansion of NRAS would not be consistent with the purpose of the scheme. It would introduce even more complexity across the standard setting, accreditation, complaints, and prosecution functions. Specifically on whether NRAS should change its criteria to expand the occupations registered, so for example, social work, so if you expand the criteria, could social work enter the NRAS? The report stated, the criteria and processes for entry to the national scheme generally align with its core purpose of protection of public health and safety, reflecting well-established principles and disciplines for assessing the impact and benefits of regulation to inform decision-making. So in short, no, the criteria is not changing. It also states, when assessing the appropriateness of a profession for inclusion in the national scheme, it is both relevant and necessary to pose the questions of whether a profession primarily delivers services in a health setting, the nature of those services, and whether regulation is best conducted through the health portfolio. So you can conclude that social work is not being considered by NRAS through criteria for entry changing or otherwise. Social work is being positioned as a social care profession. In terms of the experience of being aligned with a health regulator, similar to NRAS, England's social work also had this experience, and it was not successful. You can actually read about the England experience in a recent paper I co-authored with Dr. Kate Seymour and Louise Butler, and Olivia will put this in the chat for you. As a director of the Social Workers Registration Board, I have also learned the following regarding the pathways to national registration through the NRAS from conversations with state managers of AHPRA and with conversations with Sue Dawson, the independent reviewer. And for transparency, I have learned the following and want to share this with you. You need all all health ministers across Australia to approve entry according to the criteria. This criteria is not changing, and health ministers are not interested at this point in time. I say this because I have been told social work has never been on any agenda papers. Social work is considered by the NRAS a secondary health workforce at best, not a primary health workforce, which the NRAS prioritises. Also, the NRAS positions risk in social work coming from child protection contexts, not health. I have also learned when working with government and through my conversations, there has been no budget forecasting at all for social work to be potentially included, as the associated costs to look at all practices across Australia and prepare for an implementation plan is significant nationally, and this needs to be flagged early and discussed in budget forecasting, and this has never been. I've also been told that without immediate entry, so for example, audiology has immediate entry, it will take a minimum of 5 years to enter into the NRAS and to be up and running. But if you are not considered immediate entry, we are talking decades away. Also, I have been told, and I hear it from other counterparts, that the narrative from other states regarding the registration of social work is people are more interested in seeing how South Australia goes. So this brings me to my second the second recent milestone in the last few years, and that is the Social Workers Registration Act. This also provides us with insights into the possibilities of national registration of social work. So for those who don't know, in September 2018, the Social Workers Registration Bill was introduced into the South Australian Parliament by the Greens Minister Tammy Franks. The bill was subject to an inquiry, and a joint committee of the South Australian Parliament reviewed it. The South Australian Parliament passed the Social Workers Registration Act of 2021 on the 9th of December 2021 with input from the Liberal, the Labor parties and ministers in child protection and human service portfolios, not health. I would now like to share with you the achievements so far so that actually have been made in South Australia to provide you with insight into what is required to actually establish a registration scheme. So to give you some context, the Act was passed in December 2021, but for complicated reasons in South Australia at the time, I was appointed about 2 years later in September 2023. I appointed a staffing of approximately 10 FTE to support this work. And so the work I'm about to share with you has taken about 2 years to achieve. I also just want to flag and say that the original commencement date for our registration scheme to start was the 1st of July 2025. However, the state government made the decision earlier this year that it's best that the commencement date be set by proclamation so that the Social Workers Registration Board could have time to talk to the sector about the regulatory model. And so we have released this in July 2025. We are now currently working with the state government to prepare for the commencement date. So just to share with you some insights into what is required to set up a registration scheme, you'll see it up on my PowerPoint there. You actually need to appoint a board. You need to build an office that includes staffing and infrastructure. We also designed and built an online registration portal that's tailored for social work regulation, and we will now be able to collect data and report on the composition of the workforce. This design can be replicated in other states and territories in Australia. We have established a website to support visibility, engagement and accessibility. So there's all your infrastructure, but we have also had to develop and consult on and legally check the scope of practice, work protection. We've had to define the parameters of a practice experience pathway and establish the fit and proper person. To be able to do this, we had to do significant rounds of consultation, and we also then established 3 registration pathways to minimise disruption for the existing social work service workforce. We also, from this feedback from the sector, we had to address and design a comprehensive quality practice framework that covers a code of conduct, competencies, supervision and CPD requirements. To enable all this to be ready for commencement, we needed to seek and incorporate expert legal advice to ensure regulatory compliance. We were then able to form an organisational structure for registration, accreditation and investigation. We had to build a sustainable financial model and create a suite of policies to support the processes of our office and board. More recently, we've established our Finance Committee, our Disciplinary Advisory Board and our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Peoples Committee. We, along the way to achieve this, needed to work very closely with the Minister who's administering the Act and her team to ensure progress and accountability through the Parliament. I also wanted to share the details of what's actually required and the time it took us to achieve registration so that people have some insight into the work that needs to be undertaken. But at the same time, during these achievements, I and the Social Workers Registration Board have learned a great deal regarding implementation of a registration scheme. And so in the spirit of talking about possibilities of national registration, I felt it was important to share with you these 3 valuable lessons, hoping that such lessons will also help with progressing national registration. And I would like to go through each one of these with you. The first lesson we learnt in South Australia is that you need work protection, not just title protection. You need a transition plan and you need to engage with a range of diverse stakeholders and actually listen to their concerns. So let me talk to you about lesson 1. So lesson 1 is you need work protection, not just title protection. I've explained this in a little bit more detail in a document on our website, and Olivia will put this in the link in the chat for you to access quickly. But I also want to acknowledge that when we think about registration, we often take our minds to only title protection, and this is very important. However, the Social Workers Registration Act asked us to not only protect the title, but also to define social work services. That is, work only a registered social worker can perform or undertake. Such work sits in a broader scope of practice that we had to define. So being asked to define social work services is work protection, work that we want only social workers to do in the future. We learned that having only title protection for those with a qualification to be registered could actually have future unintended consequences, particularly the disincentive to employ social workers. Title protection must be attached to work protection. Otherwise, people can continue to do social work services with a different or a generic title. Systematic and structural changes over time have actually allowed this to happen because employers in the market have been advertising for social and human service workers with a Bachelor of Social Work, with a Masters of Social Work, being equally positioned as the same as a TAFE certificate, a generic 3-year degree, a diploma, or at times nothing at all. And that is the reality in which we are sitting. So over time, we have seen a range of different levels of qualifications and backgrounds doing the same work. That is social work services that we want to protect. So with it being difficult to ascertain who is a social worker and who is not. So if you only have title protection, this practice will continue. Those with qualifications who want to call themselves a social worker will have to pay a fee to be registered, held to a higher standard, and be required to do clinical supervision and CPD, while working alongside someone doing the exact same work, but not necessarily having the qualification and not being required to do supervision or CPD or be registered. This is currently happening in New Zealand, and they have taught us this lesson. It was also recognised in the original Social Workers Registration Bill of 2018. So we learned we need work protection to claim our expertise, just like any other professions, to uplift the quality of the profession and the standards of public safety. We also learned that when you protect work, you embed it inside a scope of practice, and then you are required to define conduct and competency around this work. The qualification then represents the education and training that's required to produce high quality graduates ready to do this work into the future. So registration is not just title protection. It is work protection. It is about conduct and competency and setting a standard for education around these elements. The second lesson that we learned is that you need a transition plan. So if you just understand the complexity I've shared with you around title and work protection, you need a transition plan to move out of this. History has also shown us that professional regulators almost always use a transition plan when a new system of registration, accreditation or regulation is being introduced into an unregulated workforce. We learned this too. And our transition plan proposed speaks to the protection of work, the social work services that we want protected. And so, as explained before, there are complicated systemic and structural reasons why people over time have been employed to do social work services without qualifications in social work. Individuals cannot be punished or disadvantaged when a regulator is introduced into the workforce. It is in social work's long-term interest to work through these systemic and structural issues, particularly those impacting on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. A transition plan brings with it an act of social justice, a listening to the workforce reality, planning responsibly and steadily with government by our side. The Social Workers Registration regulatory framework allows for this systematic and structural transition by proposing provisional and limited registration when performing social work services. This is important for the following reasons. Regulation is designed to safeguard the public, but immediately requiring anyone in a workforce to meet new standards could cause large gaps in services and unpredictability. Provisional and limited registration allows stability and it gives time for people to work through their options while we regulate social work services. Remember the high-risk work we want protected. And also remember that people who do this work cannot call themselves a social worker or claim that they are a social worker. They are being regulated to do a protected piece of work through the Social Workers Registration Board. Transition plans prevent sudden loss of workers by giving pathways for recognition of prior learning, time to do study. Transitional provisions acknowledge people's contributions in the field. It gives them time or alternatives to meet the standards. So when we do this in a collegial way, this builds trust, collegiality and legitimacy in the sector. This staged approach reduces disruption while maintaining high professional standards. And in the long term, all those doing social work services will eventually be qualified social workers with full registration. But we need to do this respectfully during transition into registration. And I would argue try and bring as many people as we can and value their work and contribution in the sector. The transition plan offers pathways into a career in social work. Isn't that what we want? Every state and territory are going to face workforce complexities when introducing social work registration, and each state and territory are going to need a transition plan. The Social Workers Registration Board's regulatory framework has a transition plan that has been built from consultation and evidence and learnings from other regulators. Registration is new in social work. It's complex and we are responding to competing issues and a diverse workforce. Solutions are important if we want the possibility of national registration. So this brings me to our final lesson, the third lesson, when implementing a regulatory framework, and that is the lesson of working closely and collaboratively with the many stakeholders that are impacted by registration and navigating their concerns and differences with them. To bring registration to fruition, including the effort to protect work and create a transition plan, you actually need buy-in, and hence you need to bring people and stakeholders along this journey with you. So to give you some insight, for the past 2 years, we have engaged in significant consultations, information sessions and meetings with individual organisations. That includes government organisations and non-governments, peak bodies representing the workforce, unions, the higher education sector, to understand people's concerns, talk through options and share progress along the way. I cannot emphasise enough that it has been vital to work in partnership with government. It's the ministers responsible to the Act to navigate the parliamentary processes. Remember, it's the government that makes registration possible. All this requires careful planning and collaboration as well as reporting. Documenting the work in setting up a scheme has been very valuable for us, and it has been necessary for the government. We have learned the importance of a structured, education-focused change management strategy in preparation for mandatory registration, including these following principles. It is important to establish a strong and compelling case for registration. It is important to build a coalition of respected leaders from across the sector. It is important to clearly communicate the workforce transition pathway so that people can see they have a place along this journey, but also to proactively identify and address concerns from stakeholders. We need to acknowledge the reality in which we're all currently working. So finally, in closing this presentation about progress to national registration, I do want to acknowledge the efforts of many people in social work advocating for registration. I have learned over the past 2 years that across the sector, largely, registration is seen as important by social workers. People agree that registration encourages high quality through holding ourselves to account to the professional values we espouse, but most importantly, registration values the work we do alongside those most vulnerable. People understand that registration protects the public through the profession being transparent about the high standards required to do social work. People agree with registration, but they are concerned about the transition and the impact on the workforce. So to enable registration, it is really important to work through such concerns at a steady pace. I want to acknowledge that the pathway into the NRAS has been and continues to be a long one, and the reviews continue to identify social work as a social care profession, not primarily health. The recent review into NRAS therefore provide us actually with an opportunity to think about and discuss our social work identity and what pathway into national registration is actually possible. I also want to talk with you today because I want to acknowledge and actually say, hey, social work registration is possible because we are implementing it here in South Australia. I wanted to share our experience with you. I want to share our lessons in the hope that perhaps we can come together to talk about what national registration might actually look like. It is actually in reach if we work collectively, collaboratively, and with consistency. Someone generally must go first, and South Australia is doing that. We are here and we are doing the work of social work registration. We have produced what is needed to commence. We have learned a great deal about the reality of getting a scheme up and running. We are more than happy to share this with you, with other states and territories to move towards registration. Registration is a legislative reality in South Australia, and it could be used as the platform for national registration. So to move forward and to a national scheme, each state and territory are really important, and they require their own working parties or groups. And there is so much goodwill to capitalise on, and South Australia is happy to share and help with this. So just imagine our own national registration framework, one that was actually built by social work, coming together to celebrate and claim the social justice agenda, which is the betterment of society through challenges of all the inequalities that we face. So I might finish there, Louise, and we're just past 11 o'clock, so we have some time for questions.
Right. Thank you, Sarah. We do have one question at this stage. Do people on the PEP pathway with over 6 years' experience need to eventually get a social work qualification, or can they forever use the title of provisionally registered social worker despite not having a social work qualification?
Yes. So at the moment, we are proposing those three registration types. So if you are in limited registration, you cannot call yourself a social worker. You are being registered to do a piece of work at a particular point in time. It is the same for provisional registration. So provisional registration just recognises another group of people with extensive experience and people who are studying their social work degree. So if you sit in provisional registration, you cannot call yourself a social worker. You can call yourself a provisionally registered social worker with the board doing this piece of work at this point in time. If you want to sit in limited or provisional registration forever, you can. That's what happens in a transition pathway. If you finish your degree, you can move to full registration. At the moment, the competency assessment to legally use the title of social worker through a competency assessment, if you have 6 years experience or more, is still currently being debated. And we will come out for consultation with regulations to talk to the sector a little bit more about this, because we are listening to people's, pros and cons around that option.
Thanks, Sarah. How is the Social Workers Registration Board ensuring current students are aware of what's happening with registration and what they may be required to comply with when it comes in?
That's a great question. So like all key stakeholders, the Social Workers Registration Board has been meeting with, in particular, the universities and the private providers here in South Australia, talking about registration and sharing materials with the higher education sector. We also encourage and support the higher education sectors to organise their own forums for students, and we are more than happy to come and talk to the students if we get that invitation. So that invitation is always open. Similarly, I want to acknowledge the heads of schools of councils of social workers. They also regularly invite me to speak about the social workers registration scheme here in South Australia. And so being able to provide them with updates and seek their feedback has also been extremely valuable.
Thank you, Sarah. Next question, how would you like to see collaboration with the AISW and other key stakeholders going forwards to achieve national registration together?
That's a great question. I think I want to answer that by going back to the purpose of this lecture, or this conversation, I should say, is that I actually wanted, the purpose of the conversation is to share learnings from South Australia. And what we have learned is that to enable registration to get up and running, you actually really need local champions on the ground. And so I want to encourage working groups, local champions forming relationships in each state and territory with each other and with their governments. This is how registration is going to get up and running. And we are really happy to support that. So the AISW has a beautiful network of branches. I would love to be able to work with the branches in each state and territory. The Council for the Heads of School has a wonderful representation of professors of social work all over this country. We also have key social workers in significant positions across health, child protection and human services. So what I would encourage is that we actually need working groups, and in each state and territory, working with the relevant government of your state and territory, and we can do that together to create a swirl to then build a national scheme that we want.
Thanks, Sarah. Just quickly, there's a comment, not a question. Congratulations on a fantastic presentation, very clear on processes and pathways with milestones, achievements which need to be celebrated. The next question is, could we all, in theory, register in South Australia if we're working in New South Wales? And I want to acknowledge that that is a question that comes into our inbox quite a lot from people interstate questioning and having a lot of interest in our system.
Thank you for those comments. If you're working in New South Wales, I'd say you're most welcome, but you do not have to register with us. And However, if you are providing services to South Australian people as a social worker, you are required to register. So if you're providing services, absolutely. If you're not, there is no need for you to register. That's why we need to move towards other states and territories picking up perhaps our legislation for registration and then building our own national framework to oversee that.
Great. The next question is about the NDIS, Sarah, and if you'd prefer me to answer it, I could. Hi there, thanks for a very informative session. Can you please speak to the matter of how registration in South Australia will impact the requirements by NDIS for social workers providing NDIS services to be members of AASW? Would we be expected to be AASW members as well as registered under the SA scheme? Or is there potential for advocacy to the NDIS to change these requirements so that registered South Australian social workers do not require AASW membership?
So that's a really good question, and it's a complex question, Louise. So I'm going to start it, and then I'm going to also ask you to help in terms of the nitty-gritty of the NDIS. I do just want to shout out that Louise very much knows the NDIS as she's worked in that space before. So firstly, to answer that question in terms of, do you need to register or not? I just want to remind people of the two big pillars of registration, and that is title protection and work protection. So regardless of which field you are working in, so if you are in the NDIS, and you are employed as a social worker, you want to use the title of social worker and you claim that identity, you are required to register. If your work and you are employed to do that definition of social work services, you are required to register. Okay, so that's the parameters that kind of dictates the question of, do I need to register or not? It'll come down to the title and the composition of that definition of social work services. Louise, do you want to say something more about that before we talk about relationships, with the AASW?
So a lot of the work that social workers do within the NDIS requires registration, and with the NDIS and the Quality and Safeguards Commission through an audit system do require people with the qualification for certain roles to be members of the AASW. And so that work at times may not look like that protected work of social work services, but because they are members of the AASW, they are required to identify as social workers. Because of title protection, they will be required to be registered. Now, when we are a national system, we will have more ability to negotiate with the NDIS about the recognition, because other professions, they are required to demonstrate they have registration. Psychologists, for example, are required to demonstrate through audit that they are registered psychologists. So there will be some movement or ability to negotiate more with the NDIS. But at this time, we simply state that if people are doing social work services, then they will need to register, and or if people are required to be AASW members, therefore they are identifying as a social worker, they will need to also register. We are happy to work with the AASW or any other body and the NDIS to look at how we can make that as streamlined as possible. Sarah, there aren't any other questions that we have at the moment. I'm just checking through, and that looks like there is. Oh, how does the variety in educational standards between providers? Brian, that's I can't see the end after that. So we will get back to you, Brian, on that question. We have another one. Given the comments about social work being considered as a social care profession rather than a health profession for social work registration to progress in South Australia, which ministers need to back this? And what is the current sense from SWRB about this progressing in the near future? I.e., what are the key barriers to overcome? Thanks,
Yep.
Chloe.
Thanks, Chloe. So I just want to remind people again that registration is made possible because it's legislated through law, the Parliament, and it's the government that passes these laws. So ours is passed, the Act is through. But the Act required us to do some really complicated things that need government gazettal. So the Labor Party here in South Australia currently is in office, and so they have a cabinet. And so we work with the Labor Party's cabinet, which makes up all the ministers of the Labor Party. So it's not just the minister administering the Act or a human service minister that we have to get across the line. We need to get the cabinet across the line. Okay, so just like it's a democratic process. Ministers are elected. Ministers have a say on these things. So it is the full cabinet that have to agree to move forward and set that commencement date. And we are working with them to do so.
Thanks, Sarah. Next question. What would be the price of registration? Would we need to have both this registration and the AASW?
Yep. So I also just want to acknowledge that the commencement date was to be set by proclamation because here in South Australia, there is a commitment to keeping the fees for registration as low as possible. So that takes a fair bit of budget forecasting, okay? And so budgets become really important with registration. That's a valuable lesson I've learned. So I just want to reassure people that there are efforts to keep these registration fees as low as possible. I also just want to remind people that a regulator is very different to an association. So an association is a voluntary membership, and an association has different purposes and aims to support the profession. And so that is your choice to support your association in terms of the benefits that an association provides. A regulator is law, and so you don't have a choice. You need to register if you want to call yourself a social worker, identify as a social worker and or work in social work services.
This one is a real follow-on, Sarah, and it just adds that bit of nuance. To be registered, will I have to be an AASW member as well?
No, you do not.
But Sarah, I'll follow on with the question from there. Some people who come to our inbox make it clear that because of their status as a mental health accredited social worker or accredited social worker, they are required to have AASW membership. So would that excuse them from having to pay the registration fee when they become registered?
Yeah, not at this point in time, Louise. So I want to go back to the question that that person so well articulated around the NDIS. So I also want to answer this question by acknowledging that over time and history, for really complicated reasons, we have the AASW that has been self-regulating, okay? And the AASW as a membership organisation has picked up, things that a regulator generally does. And that includes accreditation of higher education programs, concerns and investigations. And the AASW has done a lot of advocacy around, the status of mental health accredited practitioners for Medicare. So this has all been wonderful work that we have to recognise that the AASW has done over time for this profession. When a regulator is introduced into the sector, those things start to shift. And so traditionally, a regulator takes responsibility for accreditation and the education standards, concerns and complaints. So I want to also then reiterate your point before, Louise, as a state that's gone first, at the moment, we need to get up and running, and we probably don't have the mandate or the infrastructure or the capital to be able to talk about mental health accredited practitioners or the NDIS. What we need is other states and territories to come with us so that we can speak as a national body on these issues and do the advocacy required. Having said that, we are more than welcome to listen to people's concerns, around, having no choice but to have both membership of the AASW and regulation. And we've always had an open invitation to the AASW to discuss things like accreditation, investigation and concerns, and the unique circumstances of mental health practitioners. And that invitation remains open to talk about those things for the profession. And I really look forward to the new board. Perhaps we'll have a conversation with them about that.
Great. That actually is a good segue into the next question, Sarah. There seems to be a lot of tension between the AASW and Social Workers Registration Board. Does there look to be a path forward to better consolidate this bilateral relationship? Obviously not required by law, but seems like something that would benefit from mutual championing.
Yeah, so I just want us to be careful about constructing things like tensions or, the Social Workers Registration Board and the AASW going up against each other. I don't think that's helpful. I think that it's important to continue to have open, respectful communication. The Social Workers Registration Board, I just want to emphasise, as a regulator, we will communicate through our website and we will communicate and share information through LinkedIn. We don't use those platforms for individual debates or concerns to be answered. If people have individual concerns or situations that they want to discuss with us, I promise we have staff here that take your individual concerns seriously and we will work through with them. Again, I just want to emphasise we have always shared information with the AASW and we have an open invitation to continue to work with them.
Thanks, Sarah. There is another question, and it's just about that clarification about pathways and other degrees. It starts with sorry, and I just want to say, honestly, there is no sorry here, because if you knew this journey that Sarah and I have been on over the last 2 years to get our heads around some of this, we completely respect that this information needs to be discussed again and again and gone over again and again. So please don't apologise for asking great questions. The question is, I'm still concerned about where people with a social science degree, and that's a degree that is very common in South Australia, not social work, and have been working in social work roles for 6 years plus. Where do they sit? Will they always be provisional unless they get social work qualifications?
Yeah. So it's okay to ask this. So I'm just going to say a couple of things to try and answer it as simple as possible. At the moment, with the proposed regulatory model, so this the state government has allowed us to release this so that we can discuss it. And we've been discussing it extensively for the last 3 months. I want to acknowledge that it is this point that this person has raised that's caused a fair bit of discussion. So we're listening about it. And so at the moment, as it sits, if you have 6 years or more experience in social work services, you can sit in provisional registration. To move out of that, you either have to get your qualification or do an extensive competency assessment to call yourself a social worker with full registration, but you don't get the qualification. This model actually exists in New Zealand. That's where it's come from. However, in talking to the sector about this, there is discussion around, should it be 6 years? Should it be 10 years? Should it be 15 years? Should it exist at all? And we just have limited registration. So this is being discussed. So what I want to say is we have listened to this very carefully. Also, in terms of working closely with government, we are about to also go out for regulations. So in the Act, there are particular things that we need to regulate. And so this question of experience or the time is one thing that we can have a say on. And so we will come out and consult with the sector on regulations. And we're going to ask you this question, okay, around this experience pathway. You know, is it something we want? If so, what years would we think is sufficient? So I want to hear from you around that. And so you will have an opportunity to tell us that. And we will then be able to make an informed decision with government about the pros and cons of having that potential pathway there. So I invite you to participate in that consultation because we do want to hear what people think of it.
Thanks, Sarah. Just a couple more questions and then I think we'll be out of time. One's a quick one, and that's thank you for the great presentation and providing the resources. When would we be able to register with Social Work Registration Board, and when would we know how much it will cost for the annual registration?
That's a really good question. So we are now going to, because we've consulted widely, we're now going to start sharing with you the progress we make with government. So now we have to tidy everything up and get ready for that commencement date. It is the government that sets the commencement date, not us. And so it's been held open by proclamation. And that's done so that we can be all ready to go with that model that we've released. And so for those in South Australia, I've said this publicly, so I feel okay about saying it, is we have an election coming up, okay? And so I do not anticipate that we will commence before the election. So let's think about after the election, and I promise you will get very good lead-in time, okay, in terms of when that commencement date will be. I also want to reassure you that if the date is set, you will still have 6 months to register post that date, okay? So you'll have a lot of time. We'll ensure that you'll have a lot of time that you're able to register. When the commencement date is set, the fees will be released, okay? So that's when you'll know. So we're not going to release those fees now. Those fees will be released at the commencement date.
Thank you, Sarah. Our last question again is about the NDIS, and we understand this. We genuinely understand that there are people with qualifications in South Australia who are really going to be impacted because in a variety of settings, they will be required to have AASW membership and also be registered and pay fees with the Social Workers Registration Board. And this is a very long question, so I'm going to just very much simplify it. It's about people being required, as we talked about before. It's the follow-on question about people who are registered to provide services for the NDIS, requiring to have AASW membership, and recognising that the reason, sorry about the lights going out, the reason for that is that's the way the NDIS verify that those people have a qualification. And this person is asking us, are we going to advocate for those people and clarify that actually those people are registered and have that confirmation that way? And on this time, I might start the answer and see if you want to add anything else, Sarah. Just for that person, we are happy to answer this more completely if you come to the inbox. However, just very quickly, we have been informing the NDIS, the Quality and Safeguards Commission, that we are going to be current in South Australia, and people who work with citizens in South Australia, once we commence, will need to be registered, and that is a mechanism for that identification and regulation for South Australian members. We haven't commenced yet, so the NDIS and the Quality and Safeguards Commission will be watching, I'm sure, what happens here. We do not know what will happen in terms of what they decide to do, but this is their current, that they haven't changed their rules at the current time. But they are certainly interested in what happens in South Australia. But obviously, they can't change any rules for them whilst we are not commenced. Anything to add, Sarah?
No, I think we'll leave it there, but also just to say we have heard the concerns for the NDIS and the mental health practitioners, and we're giving it a lot of thought. Keep talking to us.
And we will continue to advocate. We are not being silent on that. We are certainly doing that work. Sarah, I think that is all the questions that we are able to answer. We've run out of time, and I know other people are coming in. The last thing is thank you very much for the informative and well put together conversation. Thank you. So I am going to leave it there and ask people to remember that you can come to our inbox and ask questions, and our priority is answering questions for people here in South Australia that are imminently impacted, but we all do get to all the other questions that come into the inbox. We've got on the screen places that you can visit or ways that you can connect to us and ask questions, and we will continue to answer them. And all the documents are in the chat, but they will also all be on the website. So we encourage you to go to the website. And just to remind people who may be new to that website, that we also have a regular newsletter where we keep people up to date with a lot of the information that they need to know, but also we keep an eye on what people are regularly asking and make sure that we not only let people know what we're doing, but try to answer a lot of questions that come in regularly. So thank you. Any last comments, Sarah?
No, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your engagement.